Division 2 content creator NYL Casual Gaming recently posted a video called When is Strikers Not the Best DPS Gear Set? There's a lot of great interesting things to like about this video, but also some problematic portions I'd like to address. We'll bring our Blake tool to bear on this issue and see if the answer really is as simple as he makes it out to be. Hey agents, it's Dispatch. Welcome to the channel, where we talk about the math, builds, lore, and game design of Tom Clancy's The Division 2. Let's get stuck into it. This video is in no way intended to throw shade at NYL. First, we'll talk about the things I appreciate about his video and his content in general, and then we'll go into the disagreements. Okay, to start off, this guy's pretty funny. He's got this kind of deadpan humor that comes out of nowhere and it always catches me off guard. He also has some pretty nifty editing and some good sound design that gives his videos a very professional feel at the same time. Second, and probably most importantly, he refers his audience to great resources for information on damage calculations and provides the DPS spreadsheet that he borrowed for the calculations in the video. This is fantastic. Not only are positive shoutouts in the community always a good thing, but also just getting more exposure for good information can only be good. Third, he responds to comments in a detailed and respectful way. I left him some critiques on his video and he actually took the time to write out a response. He backed up his opinions with reasonable logic and showed that he actually put a fair amount of thought into how he was going to present his content and how he would tackle it. Now, of course, creators aren't obligated to reply to any comments, but I think we can all agree that it's very good to see. Fourth, he's very to the point. There's no fat on these bones. He gets through the whole video in a bit under 5 minutes. That's pretty impressive, and I appreciate that he isn't wasting our time with any extraneous junk. We all know there are certain YouTubers out there who put in some gameplay or ramble just to make their videos longer. Lastly, he tackles a concept that's a bit more advanced than most content creators would be willing to broach in general. And this is where we start getting into the meat and potatoes of this specific video. Most creators and even players would just settle the answer to this question with, if you can get lots of stacks, Striker's better. Or even say, Striker's just always better. But he isn't satisfied with this. He actually goes into the damage per bullet and he even goes into the cumulative damage. But let's talk about his methodology and see if there are any holes in his analysis and get into some of the critiques that I had. He starts out the video discussing additive and multiplicative damage sources because the striker damage bonus is actually multiplicative. While he comes to the right conclusion, the example he gives just isn't right. In the scenario that he pointed out, you don't just multiply the bonus by 10%. You need to translate both of these bonuses into multipliers before you can multiply them. See my video on how to do damage calculations in the description if you're confused, or check out any of the sources he cites in his video. While he comes to the right conclusion that multiplicative damage is better in most instances, the way he got there just isn't correct. Now, he justified this to me by saying, essentially, I know the math is wrong, but we gotta keep it simple or it'll confuse people. To me, this essentially sounds like an ends justify the means kind of argument. I counter by pointing out that he could have still put the right answer in and just been more vague about how he got to it. Multiplying the 128% bonus by a 10% multiplicative would end up with 150%. And he could cut out the multiply by 10% to get 12.8% and then add it kind of business. Because if you go into detail about how to do it wrong, you're going to create confusion. If you're vague, maybe some people will say, how'd you get that? To which you would point those agents who are curious to the more complicated videos. He also could have foregone the explanation entirely and just said that multiplicative is better and, again, pointed to the more complicated videos. Okay, so that settles that part. On to his comparison here. He's got a pretty standard high-end build, maybe slightly different than the old standard meta build. That old build had the gift and sacrifice as well as the group OPs, one more providence, foxes, and contractors, if I remember correctly. His build is spec'd more into weapon damage and damage to armor rather than crit, and he's missing out on some amplified damage from the missing perfect glass cannon, but it's close enough and it's easier to farm, so I think it's fine. However, I do disagree slightly with the choice of using Vigilance on the backpack. Vigilance will turn off during fights, so it has an uptime associated with it. His calculations are assuming Vigilance is always active. If he used Composure or Companion, these two talents can have a guaranteed uptime of 100%. They'll always be active. While it is absolutely true that Vigilance is typically seen as better as it gives more damage, it still biases the comparison with Striker. Once again, he defends his position admirably by saying that Glass Cannon and Vigilance players are usually pretty passive and can have pretty good, if not perfect, uptime on Vigilance. I disagree with this, but it more so comes down to a question of each individual player. You kind of have to make this determination for yourself. It would have been good for him to talk about it at least. At this point in the video, he shows the damage numbers for the high-end build, and I really appreciate how he proofs out the spreadsheet damage with what he's seeing in-game. Most creators wouldn't do this. It shows again that he's being thorough and really thinking about his testing. He's using an IKEA spreadsheet in this one, so that's some good stuff. Next, he shows damage graphs. I love these. Once again, showing he's adding a lot of value by showing analysis in a very easy to understand way. He's talking about purely damage values here, so this is pretty straightforward and a good way to do it. Then he takes his analysis a step further. He's tying those theoretical numbers back to practical gameplay. Since the high-end build is doing more damage before the numbers equalize, how many shots need to be fired until the cumulative damage is equal? Now, something important about this, he makes a big assumption. This would be against one giant tanky enemy. He's very open about making this assumption. The word assumption has a bad connotation, but assumptions really aren't bad. Assumptions are a necessity for analysis, and you can't do any comparisons without them. You're always making assumptions, whether you think you are or not. They only get into trouble when you don't think about them. Like we talked about with Vigilance, we're assuming it has a 100% uptime. This assumption would only be a problem if we didn't think about it and justify it. Engineers, for example, in the real world, use assumptions all the time. We document them and discuss them. In this case, he can't really control how long it will take any given player to achieve these stacks when killing and switching between targets, so he has to make an assumption that the stacks are on one big enemy, just to have a sensible point of comparison. I'm actually not sure in this case if he is accounting for stack loss across these 143 hits or not, or if he's accounting for mag changes. During those time periods, you lose stacks and have to regain them before reaching parity. One assumption that he doesn't mention is that he is also assuming 100% accuracy with the weapon, so you'll only see this in the firing range. Does this issue affect the validity of his analysis, though? It is valid, but it definitely would have been better to include this, at least as a reference. Essentially, showing 100% accuracy versus 50% accuracy would have given a range that the player can digest, serving as a pseudo best case and worst case scenario for how long it takes Striker to catch up to the other build. Later, we're going to use 100% accuracy to simplify the results, and if it'll take a lot of stacks to reach parity, we might include different accuracy values. One thing he does point out at the end of this analysis is that he didn't take into account the rate of fire buff from Striker. This creates a very interesting problem. Rather than calculating the amount of hits required to reach parity, incorporating the rate of fire would require changing the graph from cumulative damage versus hits to cumulative damage versus time. This would clearly show the damage pauses from reloading, as well as a more accurate picture of the actual experience of the set, because while it might take 143 hits to reach damage parity, the Striker build will get to 143 hits much faster. The problem arises in the actual usefulness of this information. Hits are very easy to understand. The first analysis basically says you need about 2 mags worth of hits until Striker is ahead in cumulative damage. The second analysis would say you need X number of seconds before Striker is ahead. If you don't have a big target to get stacks on, it's very hard to even estimate how long you've been firing. You'll spend so much time in between enemies that it's impossible to keep track, whereas ammo expended is much easier to see. Now, tracking based on time might be a bit more accurate, but harder to measure. Either way, you'll probably end up hand-waving the conclusion a little bit. But is there an even better way to do this analysis? I think so. The Blake tool. Now, of course, there are going to be some assumptions here too, in addition to the ones I've already discussed before. The Blake tool is our special tool that calculates hits to kill and time to kill for various enemy types in the game by simulating damage against them with real damage values. You can use it too. Check it out in the description below. Because we haven't coded in striker stacking with every hit, we'll have to use an average striker stack value and bracket it from there. The first question is, how many average striker stacks do we need with the striker build to reach time to kill parity with a high-end build? We're going to use a 100% accuracy to make things simple. Remember, we're doing average striker stacks, so that's kind of hand-waving our stack loss issue as well. We'll start with 5 striker stacks to establish a baseline for striker. How bad is our initial disadvantage using striker before we can stack it up? We don't want to use 0 stacks, as that would mean we wouldn't gain any stacks by killing that first enemy. One thing that immediately strikes me as interesting when I was building these builds is the fact that the high crit chance of St. Elmo's means that the striker build isn't actually losing any crit damage. Using a piece of Cheshka on the striker build is very efficient, meaning the only crit difference between the two is 2% critical hit chance. Using Cheshka on the high-end build would actually be too much critical hit chance. You go over the cap. But that brings up another issue. We've got 15% weapon handling on our striker build, but none on our high-end. Most agents might not see weapon handling as valuable, but we'll see later that it doesn't make much difference in our on-paper time to kill, but it gives us a lot of in-game benefits. Higher hit percentage and faster reloads. If we take away 2 critical hit damage attributes and change those over to weapon handling, we've reached parity. There are a lot of ways to get what we want. This would take away 24% critical hit damage. That's pretty hard to stomach. Instead, maybe we could swap out our Fenris for Petrov, which gives us 15% weapon handling right off the rip. An important caveat is that we are going to use the Police M4 as a stand-in for the St. Elmo's, since that's basically what it is from a damage and rate of fire perspective. We'll be accounting for the St. Elmo's special attachments because we're putting in the stats manually. The only thing we won't be accounting for will be the bigger mag size and also the shock bullets, obviously. So let's go over our assumptions. 100% accuracy, accounting for 100% talent uptime by including companion, accounting for weapon handling with Petrov. Average stacks are close enough representation of how striker would actually perform. Police M4 is a representative of St. Elmo's, accounting for critical hit chance and critical hit damage, and also all of our usual Blake assumptions. These are the builds we'll be testing. NYL's original build with Vigilance, NYL's build but with Companion instead of Vigilance, and then NYL's build with Companion and Petrov instead of Fenris. Then we'll move on to our striker builds. Striker with 5 stacks, striker with 50 stacks, striker with 100 stacks, and striker with however many stacks we need to hit parity. So we might try a couple of different values for our striker stacks. Here's some footage of me inputting 2 of the builds into the Blake tool and how the tool operates. Hopefully soon we can give it a bit of a facelift so it's easier to digest. After this, I'll just skip to my tabulation of the results and further analysis. So here are the builds that I put in. So if we compare it to the original Vigilance build, we can see that the number of stacks required to reach average TTK parity is 25. Once we have full stacks, we're looking at an average TTK advantage of 0.1 seconds on a red, 0.3 seconds on a veteran, 0.37 seconds on an elite, and almost a full second on a named enemy. And if we look at the TTK distribution from the minimum TTK to the maximum TTK, we've got a range of about a quarter of a second, which is much greater than 1/10 of a second we are losing on the minimum, and the 0.05 seconds we are losing on the maximum. Basically, even though the average is in the middle, In game, you're going to be experiencing such variation between your minimum hits to kill and your maximum hits to kill that it will be nigh impossible to tell the difference between the two builds. While we're building stacks, we literally don't even have a TTK disadvantage at 5 stacks against a red as compared to the weapon handling build, which is the actual best comparison here. We have a bit of a disadvantage for bigger targets, but as you shoot them, you'll get more stacks. After the first elite or so, you'll have parity on larger targets. You will expend more ammo to get the kills until you reach damage parity, but we've got lots of weapon handling on a quick reloading weapon with a lot of ammo in the mag, so we're going to hand wave that away a bit. Of course, going into legendary or group play, the situation is only going to get better for Striker because you'll have more stacks. If you're farming challenging open world and missions, the gap between the two is going to shrink even more. You won't have basically any striker stacks, but you won't need them either. There are better builds for that kind of content. One-shot builds are very easy to build, or you can use a status build or something else, and those will all be faster. What we've discovered here is that Striker is, as expected, overpowered, and unequivocally better than at least these particular high-end builds. Could there be a better high-end build? Potentially. Absolutely. However, with the ease of use of Elmos, the old standard red DPS builds are over-spec'd on critical hit chance, so until a new best high-end DPS combination becomes apparent, I believe that this is close enough. So bottom line, technically, Striker doesn't catch up until 25 stacks, but the difference is so small with less stacks that it's basically a wash. I would always recommend Striker over a high-end build any day of the week. The high-end build is much, much harder to farm, so just don't bother. Just get your Striker build right and get busy dominating content. Real quick, as the last thing before I sign off, don't run Glass Cannon on this build. Once Obliterate is stacked, it will give you just as much damage as Glass Cannon, since we're not running any other source of total weapon damage. And this way, you won't have the incoming damage downside. Alright agents, that's all I got for this response video. Let me know what you think of these builds, and if you thought my methodology was fair. I really like NYL Casual Gaming's content. Be sure to check him out and watch his videos. Like this video, and like his video as well. It's free. Remember to also check out the Blake tool for yourself, link in the description, as well as a video on how to use it. If you want to see more content like this, subscribe and check out our playlist. I'm definitely not a big YouTuber, but we've got a fair number of videos built up for you to binge, but not so many that you'll get lost in the sauce. But anyway, thanks for watching agents, and once again, this has been Dispatch. Take care out there.